There will be people joining in, but I think we'll start. So hello and welcome. Good afternoon to everybody. We're very happy to welcome you to the 5th lecture from the series of Invited Lecture Series in Bilingualism and Multilingualism. And together with my co-convener, Professor Anna Ewert, would like to welcome everybody, especially warmly today, to an open lecture by Professor Marit Westergaard. This series of lectures is organized jointly by the Institute for Advanced Studies in Social Sciences, in Social Studies and Humanities, by the Faculty of English at Adam Mickiewicz University, and by the Poznań branch of Bilingualism Matters. And together with my colleague Anna Ewert, we have co-convened a series of 8 open lectures this academic year, inviting outstanding researchers, distinguished scholars, and experts in the field of bilingualism and multilingualism. Each lecture is delivered via Zoom platform and then is live streamed as well on the Facebook of the Faculty of English. And the lectures are available in our repository, and the website has been just posted in our chat. So please do check it, do visit our website and see the repository of all the past lectures as well. Well, today it's my great pleasure and honor to welcome a good colleague and friend, Professor Marit Westergaard from the Arctic University of Norway in Tromsø and Norwegian University of Science and Technology in Trondheim. Professor Westergaard is Professor of English Linguistics at the Department of Language and Culture at the Arctic University of Norway in Tromsø, and she also holds an adjunct professor position at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology in Trondheim. She's a fellow of the Norwegian Academy of Science and Letters. She's the director of the AQUAVA, Acquisition, Variation and Attrition Aurora Center, where she oversees several research projects on multilingual acquisition, focusing in particular on morphosyntax. Amongst them is the project on microvariation in multilingual situation, funded by the Research Council of Norway, multigender, multilingual approaches to grammatical gender, and recently ADAM, across domain investigations in multilingualism, project on modeling L3 acquisition in diverse setting, in which we closely collaborate with Marit. Her research interests include first, second, third, and bilingual language acquisition, syntactic variation, diachronic change, comparative syntax, all focusing on the multilingual context. And today, Professor Westergaard will be talking about multilingualism and cross-linguistic influence as co-variation. Marit, the floor is yours, or the screen is yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot for the invitation to speak in this series, and thanks a lot for the nice introduction. I will now share my screen with you, and I hope it works. Let's see. Can you see it now? Yeah?
Yes,
not presented you.
Yeah, it's all right. There's just the right view.
Yes.
Perfect.
So, as you see, my topic today is multilingualism and cross-linguistic influence as co-activation. This is work that I have done with many collaborators here at the Aqua Aurora Center. And my main collaborators, let's see if I can now move. Oh, well, whoops. Can you see this? You can see this now.
Yes, it's okay. Yep.
All right. For some reason, I saw something totally different. All right. So my main collaborators are Natalia Mitrofanova, Julia Rodina, Romiana Slabakova, Isabel Jensen, and Nadine Kolb. I will now give an overview of the talk. As the title said, I will talk about cross-linguistic influence, and mainly about full transfer and what I call full transfer potential. I will present a model of third language acquisition called the linguistic proximity model and the main aspects of this model. I will talk about the methodology that is optimal for testing this model. And then I will talk about three recent articles that provide some support for this model. The first part of the talk is based on a keynote article that I published in Second Language Research in 2019, and also the response to the commentaries on this keynote. The response is open access, but both articles are available from my website. So, what is multilingual or L3 acquisition? Well, it's a relatively new field within formal linguistics, I'd say 15 plus years. And the main question for the people working in this field is, what is the source of transfer or cross-linguistic influence in third language acquisition when there's more than one possible language to get influence from? So for example, if speakers have Russian as their L1, Norwegian as their L2, and are learning English as their L3, is cross-linguistic influence always from the L1, always from the L2? Could it be from either one, or could it be from both? Is cross-linguistic influence from the surface typologically more similar language, or the structurally more similar language? And is cross-linguistic influence wholesale from the whole language in one fell swoop, or is it property by property? Well, before we tackle those questions, we can have a look at findings from second language acquisition and ideas from second language acquisition, which our field of L3 acquisition builds on. So as most people here presumably know, there were many models introduced in the 1990s for transfer and the initial state of second language acquisition. And these models range from complete transfer via partial transfer to no transfer at all. And I've listed the main models here. And the last one I have put in bold, namely full transfer, full access, which is perhaps the most, the best known one, and presumably the one that has received most support in the years after the 90s. So in our view, there is considerable and convincing evidence for full transfer in L2 acquisition. But it is an important question, especially in L3 acquisition. What does full transfer really mean? Is it wholesale, or is it property by property? If we go back to the seminal article by Schwartz and Sprouse from 1996, they consider transfer as wholesale. So the first thing they say is that the initial state of L2 acquisition is the final state of L1 acquisition. And then they go on to say that the entirety of the L1 grammar immediately carries over as the initial state of a new grammatical system on first exposure to input from the target language. This initial state of the L2 system will have to change in light of target language input. That is, failure to assign a representation to input data will force some sort of restructuring of the system. So this is kind of a two-step process. First, you take the whole L1 grammar and you copy it onto the L2, and then you have to restructure it. However, it doesn't seem like everybody agreed at the time. Sharwood, Smith, and Truscott, for example, in several articles, asked the question what this actually means. And they said, does the brain actually make copies of the L1 for every language that one is ever briefly exposed to? I don't think they ever got an answer to that question. And Hawkins in 2001 said that, well, one possibility is that L1 influence in L2 grammar building only occurs at the point where the relevant representation in the grammar is being constructed. And Lydia White in 2003 also made a certain reservation by saying that maybe full transfer, well, she didn't say that it's a metaphor, but she indicates it. She says, the initial state in L2 acquisition is the L1 steady state grammar in its entirety. One needs to think of this as, in some sense, a copy or clone of the L1 grammar, a copy which can be modified without affecting the original. So, in some sense, a copy. Now, whether we look at full transfer as wholesale or property by property has consequences in third language acquisition. Since there is one model of third language acquisition, the typological primacy model, that embraces full transfer, full access as wholesale transfer. And they argue for full transfer or wholesale transfer as a reduplication, and they say literally a copy of one of the previously acquired languages at the initial stages. And the rationale for this wholesale transfer is cognitive economy. It is somehow simpler for the brain to transfer once the whole thing than to transfer a little bit many times. Schwartz and Sprouse have now also started working within third language acquisition, and they embrace the typological primacy model and go for wholesale transfer, which they call the big decision. That is, the parser makes a decision after some time, after some exposure to the L3, which of the previously acquired languages to transfer wholesale. However, in their response, in their commentary to my keynote, they say this: full transfer is the conceptually simplest and most elegant view of transfer. And they are now talking about transfer in L2. And then they say, this should not be misconstrued as an appeal to cognitive economy, a la, for example, Rothman et al., 2019. Rather, our argument is based on the simplicity of the model itself, on the assumption that non-native grammars are represented in the mind-brain as coherent systems, then beginning with a simple metaphorical copy comes for free. So here we have people in L3 acquisition arguing for copying being either a literal copy or a metaphorical copy. So it's a little bit unclear what they actually mean. But in my view, full transfer must be a metaphor, both in L2 and L3 acquisition. And when it comes to copying, I think it can only be a metaphor, like some kind of filter, in second language acquisition, but probably not in L3 acquisition. And that's something that we may talk about in the question period if you're interested. Now, if full transfer is a metaphor, then the consequence of that, in my view, is that cross-linguistic influence from the L1 or the previously acquired languages in the L3 acquisition takes place incrementally only when there is a need for a particular structure, that is, property by property. And that is why I talk about full transfer potential rather than full transfer. Now, what is full transfer potential? Well, in second language acquisition, we can list the following aspects of full transfer potential. First of all, the L1 is the initial state of the L2. So just as what Schwartz and Sprouse claim for full transfer, full access. But then we argue the L1 is always active. So there's no need to make a copy of it. You can always access the L1 directly. Therefore, cross-linguistic influence is property by property, and the L2 grammar is built up incrementally based on an interaction of input and whatever innate endowment that we have for language acquisition, just like in first language acquisition. And I'm referring here to my micro-Q model of first language acquisition, which I developed some years ago. And in addition to input and the innate endowment, there is, of course, also cross-linguistic influence from the L1. Now, it's not really possible to distinguish between wholesale and property by property transfer in second language acquisition, because whenever you see transfer, you don't know if it happened at the initial state or whether it happened as you were testing it or as it appeared. But in third language acquisition, it should be possible to distinguish between the two. So in third language acquisition, full transfer potential means that the initial state of third language acquisition is both previously acquired languages. And both of these languages are always active. So again, there's no need to make a copy of one of them because they can both be accessed directly. Just like in L1 and in L2, the L3 grammar is built up incrementally. There's no wholesale transfer in one fell swoop. And cross-linguistic influence is property by property. Now, this means that cross-linguistic influence can be from either or both previously acquired languages. And it takes place throughout the learning process, so there's no special status of the initial stages. So this means that full transfer potential then means that anything may transfer, but not that everything does transfer. And note that this is different from the partial transfer models of the 1990s, which argued that there were some aspects of the grammar that would never transfer, typically properties that would be found in the C domain. Now, let's have a closer look at third language acquisition. There are several approaches to third language acquisition on the market these days. There are studies that argue for transfer from the L1. There are studies that have found transfer from the L2. And thirdly, there is what is called the cumulative enhancement model, which argues that both languages may affect the L3, but only in a positive way. So there shouldn't be any non-facilitative transfer. There are more approaches, and these three are the ones that I will be talking about the most today. The typological primacy model that I've already mentioned, which argues for wholesale transfer at initial stages from the typologically closest language. And typological proximity is determined by the parser based on a four-way hierarchy. That is, the parser first looks at the lexicon of the L3, and if it's similar to one of the previously acquired languages, it will transfer that language wholesale onto the L3. If there are no cues in the lexicon, if the lexicon doesn't tell you that the L3 is more similar to one of the previously acquired languages, the parser goes down to the next level, phonology, and sees if it can make the big decision based on phonology. If there is no cue there, it goes on to morphology and then syntax. All right, the next two models both argue for property by property transfer, not wholesale. The first one is the scalpel model by Romjana Slabakova, and to quote her here, she says, "The grammars already acquired act with a scalpel-like precision to extract the L1 or L2 options relevant to the acquisition task at hand. Transfer is selective and works property by property." And the linguistic proximity, which is the model that I have developed with my colleagues here in Tromsø, we completely agree with the scalpel model in this respect. So let's have a closer look at the linguistic proximity model. In the first article where this was introduced in 2017, we said that LN acquisition involves property by property learning and allows for both facilitative and non-facilitative influence from one or both previously acquired languages. Cross-linguistic influence occurs when a particular linguistic property receives supporting input from the involved languages, regardless of order of acquisition, that is whether it's the L1 or the L2, or general typological grouping. So whether it's a Romance language or a Germanic language or a Slavic language or whatever. Now this is formulated a little differently in Westergaard 21, that is the response to the commentaries, where I say that cross-linguistic influence in third language acquisition is the result of co-activation of corresponding structures in the previously acquired languages. Now, some models make a distinction between transfer and cross-linguistic influence or cross-linguistic effects. So for especially people in the TPM will define transfer as reduplication of a representation from previously acquired linguistic representations. That is, transfer is somehow a shortcut compared to learning by processing. While cross-linguistic effects, that refers to temporary bleeding of one language into another in processing, and that can be property by property. But when I see this distinction, I wonder, how can we actually distinguish between these two types of influence when we see them in the data? How do we know that one is transfer and the other is just cross-linguistic effect? It must have something to do with stability. But stability is not a dichotomy, it's a relative concept. So according to the LPM, we're only talking about representations, and they can be stable or unstable. So in our view, processing builds representations which gradually stabilize. And co-activation of structures from both previously acquired grammars reflects the instability and variability that is typical of early L3 grammars. I think that we would expect copying of a representation to result in a more stable representation immediately, and that's not what we typically see in early L3 grammars. So is there a fundamental distinction between transfer and cross-linguistic effects? No, in our view, no. There's really only one mechanism responsible for cross-linguistic influence, which is parsing or processing. And in fact, we tend to agree with Mike Sharwood-Smith, who says that the term cross-linguistic influence is really preferable to transfer, because transfer hails back to behaviorist ideas, the contrastive analysis of the 50s and 60s. It gives misleading connotations of movement and copying, and it maintains an unfortunate division between representation and processing. Sharwood-Smith has developed a framework which is called the modular cognition framework, where he argues that growth of grammatical representation is an outcome of processing in real time. And this sounds very much like what we argue in the LPM. And in this model, cross-linguistic influence is a matter of alternative connections within a network that will be shared through co-activation, not transferred or copied. So he uses the term sharing rather than transferring or copying. And if we look at the LPM in these terms, then processing in L3 results in parallel activation of several candidate structures stored as part of the grammars of the previously acquired languages. Any property can be shared, reflecting full transfer potential, but what is actually shared will depend on the outcome of competition between candidates. So how does this co-activation work? Well, we have to distinguish between comprehension and production. In comprehension, learners attempt to parse the L3 input, and they scan their previously acquired languages. If they find a similar or identical structure, they will use that for parsing the incoming stream, and this will result in a relatively weak representation that will be stored as an L3 representation. This representation may be strengthened with further input and use, alternatively washed out if further input does not support it. And in production, in cases where the L3 representation is either non-existent or too weak, learners will activate the corresponding structures in the previously learned languages, selecting the one that is most strongly activated. The most important factor is structural similarity, but other factors may also affect the strength of the activation. It could be frequency, recency, proficiency, and so on. And interestingly, Truscott and Sharwood-Smith also argue that all representations have a resting level of activation. And when they are activated in processing, they enter a temporary state called working memory. Now, after they have been activated, they return to a more accessible resting level. And this then corresponds to what we argue is, processing builds representations or more stable representations. But there are numerous studies that support superficial typological similarity as the most important factor for transfer or cross-linguistic influence, that is, studies supporting the TPM. One important such study is Rothman and Cabrelli-Amaro from 2010, where they investigated L1 English, L2 Spanish speakers learning either L3 Italian or L3 French. And it turned out that both groups transferred pro-drop syntax from Spanish into the L3, which was facilitative in Italian, but non-facilitative in L3 French. Now, the authors interpreted this as evidence for wholesale transfer from the typologically more similar language, that is Spanish, in both cases. Now, how will the linguistic proximity model account for such results? Why didn't the L3 French group not transfer from English, which has the same non-pro-drop syntax as French? Well, again, the answer is co-activation. The lexical similarity between L3 French and L2 Spanish in Cabrelli-Amaro's and Rothman's study will also more strongly activate the syntax of Spanish to the extent that it will win over the other previously acquired language, which is English, as long as there is no stable L3 representation to block this, so typically at early stages. So this is what we mean when what we meant when we said in our original article that as exposure to the L3 grows, the role of overall typological proximity should decrease, while the role of more abstract structural similarities should increase. Now, this means that the TPM and the LPM are actually quite similar. In fact, it seems the only thing that divides those two models is the concept of wholesale transfer on the one hand and property by property on the other. So we think that in order to distinguish the LPM from the TPM, we need to use an experimental design where we compare the L3 group with L2 learners with only one of the previously acquired languages. We call this a subtractive language group design, so that in Cabrelli-Amaro and Rothman's study, the L3 learners should have been compared to L1 English and L1 Spanish learners of L2 French to see, to what extent the, to isolate the effect of individual languages. So let's have a look at the methodology that is best suited to test the LPM. So first of all, the subtractive language group design, where we identify the participant groups. If we have an L3 group where the target language is C and the learners already know A and B, they should be compared to L2 groups learning language C, but where one group has language A and the other group has language B. So if we find a difference between an L2 group and the L3 group, we can attribute that to the influence from the subtracted language, given that we have controlled for all other factors, of course. Then to the properties that we should choose. Ideally, we should have two properties. where property 1 is shared by the target language, C, and language A, and which differs from language B. Whereas property 2 is shared by languages C and B, but they differ from language A. The prediction then is that the group that has languages A and C should score higher on property 1, the one that is shared between those two languages, whereas group B, groups B plus C would score higher on property 2, as we see in this graph here. And then, let's see, the third item here under methodology is timing. We have to test the learners at the right time. So from the point of view of choosing specific linguistic properties to test, it's crucial to avoid floor effects and ceiling effects. So that means that the linguistic properties should be matched in terms of relative age or stage of acquisition. And this information will determine at what developmental stage the participants should be tested. Now, if the timing is right, then the LPM will predict that the L3 learners would score in between the two L2 groups, because the L3 group has co-activation of competing related structures in both previously acquired languages. That is, they have facilitative influence from one language and non-facilitative influence from the other one, and therefore they should score in between the L2 groups, and it should look like the graph that we have here. Now, if the timing is not right, we may see that the L3 group patterns with the low accuracy L2 group, that is when they haven't yet discovered the structural similarities between the L3 and the facilitative previously acquired language. It could also be that they pattern with the higher accuracy L2 group when they have already learned to inhibit the influence from the non-facilitative language. Now that sounds like we predict anything, but we don't, because what we don't predict is that the L3 group scores higher than the high accuracy group, that is higher than the group that only has facilitative influence, when the L3 group also has non-facilitative influence. And we don't predict the L3 group to score lower than the low accuracy L2 group, that is the group that only has non-facilitative influence. So we don't expect to see patterns like the one we see in the graphs here. Now, is there any empirical support for the LPM? Well, we had some in the original article, and we have seen several studies supporting the LPM since then. Now I would just like to very relatively briefly show you 3 recent studies where in the first one, we look at the acquisition of English as an L3 by Russian, Norwegian bilinguals. In Article 2, we look at also the acquisition of English as an L3 by Russian, German learners. And in study 3, which is a little different, we look at the acquisition of an artificial language by Norwegian English bilinguals. So let's have a look at the first study. That's Jensen et al. 2021. It's published in, it says here, in International Journal of Multilingualism, and the second study is published in International Journal of Bilingualism. In this study, we tested as many as 7 experimental conditions from 3 linguistic domains based on structural similarities between the L3 English and the 2 previously acquired languages. So we tested morphology, agreement, and copula, and the properties that are in orange here are similar to Russian, and the ones that are in blue are similar to Norwegian. And we tested both, we tested morphology, syntax, and semantics. Our participants are Norwegian L1 learners of English, as many as 90 of those. Then we had Russian-Norwegian bilinguals, 31 of those. And then we had L1 Russian learners in Russia learning English as an L2. So those are the with 2 control groups and the L3 group in the middle here. The groups were matched for age, length of exposure to English, and proficiency in English. Now, the results show that timing is really important and an important challenge when we investigate different properties because they're not all learned at the same time. So for 4 out of them, we found that the L3ers patterned with a higher accuracy monolingual group, suggesting successful inhibition of the non-facilitative language. But for 1 experimental property, we found that the L3ers differ significantly from both monolingual control groups, suggesting CLI from previously acquired languages. And we can see, and this is the agreement condition, and here we see the 2 L2 groups. We see that the Russian group scores much higher than the Norwegian group. The Norwegian group doesn't have any subject-verb agreement. And when we look at the bilinguals, they look like this. So they're not similar to either one of them. They are in the middle. Now we move on to the next study, which is Kolb et al. 2022. It's also an acceptability judgment task. And here we tested 4 linguistic properties. And this table is a bit, has a lot of information. But what is important to notice is that English, the L3, shares 2 properties with Russian. They are the ones in blue here, adverb placement and what we've called topicalization here. Whereas German shares 2 other properties with English, namely subject auxiliary inversion and determiner use. So those are marked in red here. The participant groups are L3 learners of English, 66 of them in Germany. Then we have 2 L1 groups, 1 in Russia, 26 of them, and L1 German, L2 English in Germany. Again, the groups were matched in age, length of exposure to English, and proficiency. And the results showed this time that for 3 of the 4 experimental properties, the L3ers differ significantly from both L2 groups, suggesting cross-linguistic influence from both previously acquired languages. But then we started asking ourselves the question, could it be that half of them have influence from German and the other half are similar to the Russians? So, half of them transferred wholesale from Russian and the other group from German. Then we looked at the individual level, and what we found was that the bilinguals do not form 2 distinct, do not form 2 distinct groups patterning with the control groups, but exhibit a pattern in line with cross-linguistic influence from both languages. And I can show you a graph here where we have compared 2 of the properties, and the monolingual Russians learning English as an L2 score above average on adverb placement, where English is similar to Russian, but below average on determiner use. And we find their scores in this blue rectangle. Whereas the Germans are the opposite. They score above average on determiner use, but below average on adverb placement. Now, what about the L3ers? They seem to perform in between the L2 groups on both conditions. So we have no evidence that this in-between performance is the result of half of the bilinguals behaving like L1 Russian children and the other half like L1 German children. It really looks like they have cross-linguistic influence from both languages. And now to the last study. that I have done with my PhD student, Isabel Jensen. And we focus on a very early stage of third language acquisition. Now, in the two previous studies, the learners of English had already had English for 5-6 years. So they're not at the initial state or initial stages of third language acquisition. So what happens at the very early stage? And we have looked at an artificial language as an L3. In this study, we focus on the factors for cross-linguistic influence, especially the hierarchy of the typological primacy model. Remember that this is a four-way hierarchy where the learners first look at the lexicon to find cues, which of the previously acquired languages is more similar to the L3. Then they look for, if they find no cues in the lexicon, they look at phonology and then morphology and syntax and so on. Our research questions for this study were the following. First of all, does lexical phonotactic similarity to a previously acquired language predict word order choices in L3 acquisition after minimal exposure to the target language? And secondly, does syntactic similarity to a previously acquired language predict word order choices in a third language after minimal exposure to the target language? The predictions of the three models that I said we would focus on are the following. The linguistic proximity model, the scalpel model, and the typological primacy model would all predict that lexical phonotactic similarity would play a role. But when it comes to syntactic similarity, only the linguistic proximity model and the scalpel model would predict that syntactic similarity would play a role, whereas the typological primacy model would say no, because once a learner sees that the lexicon is similar, the lexicon of the L3 is similar to one of the previously acquired languages, transfer from that language will happen wholesale, and there's no need to look any further down the hierarchy, morphology or syntax, because wholesale transfer has already taken place. In this study, our participants are L1 Norwegian, L2 English learners, 120 of them, and the L3 are 4 different artificial languages. So we had 30 participants for each language. They are very similar, but they're slightly different. And we first exposed them to the language, then we trained them, and then we tested them with a forced choice acceptability judgment task. As I said, we had 4 different artificial languages, 4 different inputs. In input A, the learners were exposed to Norwegian-based lexical phonotactics and neutral syntax, that is syntax that is the same in English and Norwegian. So basically subject, verb, object order. That's what they were. That's the syntax that they were exposed to. In input B, the words and the phonotactics were English-based, but the syntax was still neutral. They were only exposed to SVO, which we find both in English and Norwegian. In input C, they were again exposed to Norwegian-based lexical items and phonotactics, but now the syntax was English-based. So there was a mismatch between the lexicon and the syntax. In fact, they were exposed to do support, which only exists in English and not in Norwegian. And input D was the other way around, English-based lexical items and phonotactics, and the syntax was Norwegian-based, namely post-nominal possessives. The lexical inventory of the artificial languages consisted of 6 nouns words, and they were labels of fruit. And then when we wanted to construct sentences, we had to use pseudocognates in the 2 languages. Otherwise, it was just too hard for the learners to learn that. So they had to learn 6 nouns, and then the other words in the sentences were very similar to either Norwegian or English so that they could figure out what the sentences meant. The phonotactic inventory was then subsets of Norwegian and English, either unique sounds or sound combinations. And since the participants saw these words written, we used orthography. So for example, the letters that only exist in Norwegian, AØ, and letters that are only used in loan words in Norwegian, so Z and W. Here's the lexicon, the six fruit labels, and in Norway, the Norwegian words look very Norwegian, but so hjube, fnitt, okra, føm, gau. I think you will agree that they don't look English. And the English-based lexicon is more English-like. We tested them on just one experimental condition, namely verb second word order. Norwegian has verb second, so on Mondays, eat I apples, whereas English is not verb second. On Mondays, I eat apples. What's important to note here is that the participants were not exposed to these structures, and we did this to distinguish between learning and cross-linguistic influence. So they hadn't learned this. Here's an example from the animated video that we used in the exposure phase, where they were exposed to the lexical items and subject, verb, object, word order. So this woman says, so there is a calendar with the days of the week. So day mon is of course Monday and so on. And she says, I eat nib on day sat, which means I eat bananas on Saturday. And also the exposure phase, when they were exposed to pseudocognates and syntax from one of the languages. So this is English lexicon phonotactics, but Norwegian syntax, that is the post-nominal possessive. So husband, my, you can say in Norwegian, but not in English. So this is an example of the mismatched cues. Then we trained them on the items. We gave them the word, and then they were supposed to select the item. And then we tested them in the following way. We gave them 2 sentences, and this is the Norwegian-based lexicon and phonotactics, which means on Wednesdays, I eat banana. Pondagons jeg knetter hjube. And then they had a choice of either the English word order, V3, or the Norwegian word order, V2. And they simply had to select one of them. And note, they hadn't learned it. They had to kind of guess, depending on what they had been exposed to, right? So what did their results show? Well, if they chose the Norwegian word order, V2, this shows up as green here. And if they chose V3, the English word order, it's orange. Now we see the phonotactic input below. We see that if they had, in the first column, if they had English phonotactics and neutral syntax, they chose the English word order. In the second column, we see that if they saw Norwegian phonotactics and just neutral word order, they predominantly chose Norwegian word order, V2. But let's go to the incongruent cases where they had phonotactics and syntax. We see that with English phonotactics and Norwegian syntax, that is the post-nominal possessives, they chose V2 significantly more often than when they didn't have the syntactic information. So if we compare columns 1 and 3, we see that they produce more V2 if they had been exposed to Norwegian syntax. And in the final column, we see that if they had Norwegian-based phonotactics, and heard English syntax, they chose V2 less than when they had neutral word order. So if we compare column 2 and column 4, we see that they have less Norwegian word order in the fourth column, where they had been exposed to English-based syntax. So if we look at these results in relation to the predictions, then the ones I have marked green here, yes, that's what happened. But we saw that syntactic similarity plays a role. So it doesn't seem that the typological primacy model was right about their predictions here. So if we look at our research questions again, does lexico-phonotactic similarity to a previously acquired language predict word order choices in third language acquisition after minimal exposure to the target language? The answer is yes. There is a statistically significant relationship between word order choices, that is V2 versus V3, and the lexico-phonotactic similarity, that is Norwegian versus English. This result is compatible with all the three models, the LPM, the scalpel model, and the TPM. But when we go to the second research question, whether syntactic similarity can also play a role at a very, very early stage, yes, we found that too. There is a statistically significant relationship between word order choices and the syntactic similarity of the previously, or one of the previously acquired languages. And this result is really only compatible with the LPM and the scalpel model. This result can't be accounted for by arguing that there is immediate wholesale transfer of the previously acquired language that is lexically most similar to the L3 according to the four-way hierarchy. So our conclusion is that syntax also matters at very early stages. Whether this was perhaps too early for wholesale transfer to have taken place. I mean, it's possible that proponents of the TPM would say, this is too early, it takes longer for wholesale transfer to take place. But what we have found is at least that it doesn't happen immediately, even when the cues are very clear. So if we try to explain the results in light of the LPM and the modular cognition framework of Truscott and Sharwood-Smith, we could say that first the visual system interprets the written input, and then it interacts with the conceptual system, the phonological system, and the syntactic system. And both word orders, the word order of Norwegian and English, are activated in parallel and compete. The one with the strongest activation wins. And what we also see is that there is a stronger effect of lexico-phonotactic cues, and we think that is due to immediate access to cognates and similar sounds. It takes longer to process that the structure is also similar. So to summarize, this is my last slide, and conclude the talk. I have presented the linguistic proximity model, which argues that L3 learners have access to all previously acquired grammars. I've argued for full transfer potential, which is property by property at all stages of development, not just the initial stage. Learning takes place by parsing and processing, not by copying and restructuring. And there is no distinction between transfer and cross-linguistic effects. Instead, we consider only representations that can be either unstable and become increasingly stable with processing and use. And cross-linguistic influence is co-activation. And this co-activation is based on linguistic similarity, typological proximity at early stages, and presumably many other factors that we still need to investigate. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for the most exciting lecture. Thanks so much, Marit.
Thank you very much, and the speaker. And now we proceed to the question session.